Hello, we're filming at Bright Event Productions. Welcome to the Nashville Fashion Week digital experience. I'm Connie Cathcart Richardson, and this is my partner, Marcia Masula. We're co-founders and managing partners of Nashville Fashion Week and the Nashville Fashion Forward Fund of the Community Foundation of Middle Tennessee. This week looks much different than we had originally planned for April. Despite a tornado, a global pandemic, social injustice, and many other obstacles, we have put together 5 days of free digital programming to celebrate all things Nashville fashion from the comfort and safety of our own homes. It is our pleasure to present fashion talks, 3 learning labs, 19 local designers, and daily Shop Nashville retail events and promotions. These were designed to impact, engage, and encourage our local fashion community. We want you to get to know and support the people, brands, and businesses that are Nashville fashion.
Nashville Fashion Week was conceived in 2010 to foster Nashville's heralded community spirit and concentration of creative, fashion-forward, and entrepreneurial talent. We have grown tremendously since then, and in our 10th year, we took the necessary steps to continue safely supporting the fashion community during a time when they need it the most. While our funding is completely based on sponsorships and ticket sales for our live events, we too felt the heavy losses of the challenging circumstances that we are all experiencing right now. The Nashville Fashion Forward Fund of the Community Professionals with Ties is an endowed fund that supports the next generation of fashion industry professionals with ties to Middle Tennessee. This fund provides an annual financial award and resources for experiential professional development opportunities. Normally, 100% of the proceeds from Nashville Fashion Week benefits the fund for a single award. We were able to make an exception due to extenuating circumstances and issued $500 grants to all 19 participating 2020 designers. We recognize the significance in offering encouragement and financial assistance to help them transition during this time. We also have made all of our digital programming free and donated over 1,000 masks to Mass Now Tennessee, thanks to the pre-sales of our We Are Nashville t-shirts and our sponsors, On Point Manufacturing. We encourage you to continue to celebrate and support our fashion community this week and for the upcoming months of uncertainty. And if you're able and capable, we hope that you also consider making a donation to our Nashville Fashion Forward Fund at NashvilleFashionWeek.com. Stay safe, and we hope to see you in person for Nashville Fashion Week 2021.
Hello, and welcome to day 2 of the Nashville Fashion Week digital experience. Yesterday we lived through a hurricane hitting right as we started, so bear with us. We managed to get through that. We don't expect any technical difficulties today, but if we do, this is all new. Today we joined the Tennessee State Museum for a very special presentation of their women's suffrage exhibit that just recently opened last week, Ratified, the Tennessee Women and Right to Vote. Amanda McCrary Smith, the curator of Fashion and Textiles at the Tennessee State Museum, will discuss the statement the suffragists were making with the clothing and colors that they wore as they marched in the parades for women's voting rights, and will guide us through the exhibit. Amanda earned her BA in History and American Studies at Lipscomb University, her MA in American Cultural and Intellectual History at MTSU, and her graduate certificate in Costume and Textiles Collection Management from California State University at Long Beach. She comes to the museum from a long career in collegiate instruction and is currently pursuing her doctorate in museum studies at MTSU with an emphasis in material culture. We're going to leave about 10 minutes at the end of the program for Q&A. We've compiled some pre-selected questions from those that you submitted. We'll also be watching the chat for anything that adds to the discussion. So without further ado, let's jump into this. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Amanda Smith.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining me. The last time I did a presentation, I was in my kitchen, so this is exciting. I'm actually at the museum. I'm really grateful that you chose to support Nashville Fashion Week, and by virtue of that, supporting us with our programming. I know that you've already been told a little bit about me, and I'll spare you repeating of my degrees and whatnot. But my background as a historian is in material culture, historiography, and dress history. So for me, the history of suffrage, and especially the fashion of suffrage, wasn't something that I really thought about at great length until I started working for the Tennessee State Museum, because the Ratified exhibit has been in the works for many years. And so when I first started, which was not that long ago, it was last year, we were, at the height of getting everything ready for suffrage, and I got to handle some of the fashion artifacts, some of the dresses that you're going to see at the end of the presentation. And it really made me think about situating myself in the question of suffrage. I'm a native Nashvilleian, and so the fact that our exhibit, Ratified, is about Tennessee was important to me. And as I was going through some of the artifacts for suffrage and really thinking about the 19th Amendment and that it's its 100th anniversary, I realized that my own grandmother, my father's mother, was 18 in 1920. So, she was right there with the young women who, I don't know if she marched, I don't know if she was a suffragette, but she was a person who was the recipient of the right to vote. And then, my great grandmother, who I knew all of my life, she was 13 when the 19th Amendment was passed. And so that gave it a really personal feeling for me. And I feel pretty personal about most of the artifacts that I work with, but especially women's suffrage, it really made it something that was special for me. And I hope that I get to show you that with some of the artifacts we're going to have on exhibit, and then through talking about how women established themselves as their their fashion and as their style of the suffragette, as the presentation is called. So let me, and if I do this wrong, somebody help me. Okay. So we'll make sure. Okay.
You're good.
So let's go back to the very beginning. I think unless you are a Tennessean, or unless you're a person who has worked here at the museum through all of the suffrage preparation, I think maybe it is a little perplexing if you just said Tennessee's role in the suffrage movement. So just a brief introduction to why Tennessee is so important when it comes to suffrage is on August 18th, not too long from now, 1920, the vote to pass the 19th Amendment had yet to be, or the vote had passed, but it had yet to be ratified. And Tennessee was the 36th state to do so. So they needed that 36 state majority, and it came down to what Tennessee legislatures decided. And this is a legendary story in Tennessee. If you come to the exhibit, you can hear the whole tale of Harry Byrne and how his mother told him he best vote for suffrage or else. But Tennessee is that state, is the pivotal state in gaining women the right to vote. And so it's especially poignant, this particular exhibit, that, it is focused on Tennessee. And then the suffrage movement in Tennessee also, this is a very important part of the movement, is that it included women of all different backgrounds, races, economic backgrounds. It wasn't just one small group of women, it was women unified across the state, across the counties, to win the battle for the 19th Amendment. And then, to celebrate that, our exhibit Ratified, as Connie mentioned, opened last Friday. And so you'll be able to see some of those stories. But let's go back to what exactly style and dress mean, which is the focus for this. I think we're kind of used to, when we think of style and dress, we're used to the concept of branding. We're used to, being able to say what we want on our clothing. So if I support a cause, or if there's a particular thing that I like, I can wear clothing that expresses that, and there really isn't any kind of repercussion. We are really liberated in what we're able to wear nowadays, which is something that I would encourage you to think about, because when you think about people in the past and what they were able to wear, I think for me it feels, I feel personally privileged that I can stand here and talk to you in comfortable clothes, and what I want to wear. I can have on my jeans, I can wear pants. I wasn't going to admit this, but I have on a fancy blazer and a fancy shirt, but I have on my tennis shoes. So, I have this liberated way that I can dress. That hasn't always been the case in the past. And I know since everyone who is here is a fashion person that you understand the difference between dress and style. But dress is, literally what we wear. Style is kind of what we choose to wear and how we define ourselves or how it defines us. But in the past, there wasn't really a lot of ways that you could define yourself as different in society. Like you had to wear what society deemed necessary for you to wear, especially for women. And one of the things that changed all of that was the French Revolution. And it seems like it's a long way from the French Revolution to the history of Tennessee suffragists, but it's really not. The French Revolution was one of the first political movements that used a specific form, a specific look of dress to signal support for the cause. It started this concept of wearing what you wanted during the French Revolution. It has its roots in these antiquated laws called sumptuary laws. And sumptuary laws meant that you could wear, there were things that you could not wear. So if you were a person of means, you could wear a certain style of lace. If you were not a person of means, you could not wear that particular type of lace. And what caused that relationship of clothing and class was that starting in the 14th century, moving into the 1500s, 1600s, with Atlantic trade. So when people started bringing in all kinds of different goods, luxurious goods to the market, like silks, that could be woven into velvets or satins and then fine lace products. When the time for colonization in places like North America happened, it meant that only wealthy could afford some of these luxury items. And it also meant that they wanted those luxury items. And so they weren't going to allow other people to have them. So they passed these sumptuary laws that said that only the wealthy could dress a certain way. And that was especially true in France. France was importing all kinds of luxurious goods like silk, cottons from the Americas. Believe it or not, there was a time when cotton was considered a luxury good. And so the wealthy were taking all of those different products or those different materials, and they had a monopoly on them, and they would not allow the lower classes to wear them. And in France, this came to a head with fashion representing a movement because they were on the precipice of a revolution very similar to what what America had gone through in the 1770s. And in 1789, when the French Revolution began, new ideas about what people could wear originated as a form of protest. You can see in this illustration here, what these people are wearing. It may not even look that strange or risque or any of that to us, but what they are wearing is actually a very radical form of protest. There are a group of people who call themselves the sans-culottes, and the sans-culottes literally meant like without breeches. So they were not identifying themselves with the wealthy classes by wearing the knee breeches that the wealthy wore. And then the red Pharyngian cap, which actually goes back further than the French Revolution, but was used as this kind of liberating imagery during the French Revolution, is what he has on his head. And that becomes probably the most visible of the symbols of the French Revolution. And men and women both wore these types of styles. So you have women wearing pants, women wearing men's styles, which was unheard of in 1789. It was actually pretty much unheard of anywhere. And so it became about fashion and it became about style, but what they were wearing was also radical. And it was even thought of by the French monarchy as treasonous. And I don't think any of us have probably ever had to think of our clothing as treasonous, which, or at least I hope that we haven't. But this was a time where if you wore, if you singled yourself out and explained to the wealthy or signified to the wealthy that you were against them, you could be charged with treason. You could be put to death for what you were wearing. And the French Revolution is really the beginning of this identification through clothing of yourself as the resistance. And that was the sumptuary laws in France. And as it says at the bottom of this slide, though it wasn't declared by law, people in other places were ruled by kind of inferred sumptuary laws. So there was this idea that you couldn't wear certain things that was suggested instead of it being a law that was written on the books. So what does the French Revolution have to do with Tennessee and suffragettes? It has a lot to do with it. And like I said, it was really the first time that the French Revolution was the first time people identified themselves as being the opposition. And some of you may know about suffrage, you may know your history of suffrage, but there are two different suffrage movements. There's the British suffragette movement, and then there are the suffragists in the United States. And that's how we usually differentiate them, is British are suffragettes, Americans are suffragists. And I'll try to keep that straight just to be correct. But when we're talking about the suffragette movement, England, suffragists, we're talking about the United States. So the movement to gain the vote for women first started in England and then the United States, but they influenced each other. And one of the ways that they influenced each other was through the clothing that they wore, and especially the colors that they wore. In the Victorian period, which is the bulk of the suffragette and suffragist movement, happened during the Victorian period, so the early 1800s into the very beginning of the 20th century in the 1900s. There were very rigid class rules about what you could wear. And again, these are not enforceable laws. They are things that are suggested by custom. And especially what women should wear. There was this idea that Victorian womanhood, the imagery of womanhood or the signifiers of womanhood needed to be things that were very, they were very modest. They were often made, if you were a wealthy woman, out of some of those luxury goods that I talked about earlier. They were very complicated, which I know that some of you have seen what people wore then. This is a little slide about when was the stress in fashion, going through approximately the Victorian period. You can see the changes in silhouettes. There are a lot of different changes in the sizes of the skirts and the shapes of the sleeves, but what they all have in common is they're all very complicated garments, and they do not allow for a significant amount of movement. They have enormous underskirts, tight corseted bodices or stays that are worked into the bodices. And most of the time when people went out in public, you can see that in this illustration too, it was appropriate to wear a hat. So women were covered from head to toe. And what that also meant was you were signifying also that you did not either have to work if you were a wealthy woman, and then other times clothing would be something that would just make it impossible for women to work. And we'll see that start to change as the suffragette movement goes on, and as the Victorian movement goes on and people start working. The British suffragettes were the first to adapt their style and their colors when it came to signifying themselves as part of a movement. They were very deliberate in what they chose, and I don't know if you've thought about that at length. I know it's easy to signify, or it's easy to see those signifiers when you see pictures of suffragists or suffragettes and suffragists. They have on all white. They're wearing purple and green, or they're wearing gold if they're in the American suffragist movement. But all of those colors mean something very specific. The British women's suffrage colors were purple, white, and green, and then purple, white, and gold were the colors of the American suffragist movement. And when the Women's Social and Political Union in England was looking for a color scheme to distinguish themselves, the reason that they chose it, and I'm going to read you a quote. Emmeline Pethick Lawrence, who is the editor of a magazine called Votes for Women, explained, purple, as everyone knows, is the royal color. It stands for the royal blood that flows in the veins of every suffragette, the instinct of freedom and dignity. White stands for purity in private and public life, and green is the color of hope and the emblem of spring. So those were chosen very deliberately to mean those things. And then the white as purity, that was something that was chosen deliberately for its purity or to show purity, but it also was chosen because it is a very striking image to imagine, hundreds of women marching down the street dressed completely in white. It really had a visual impact, and you can see that even when you look at black and white photos. And we'll look at some of the marching suffragettes here in a minute. On the right,
excuse me, have you got a mic on? I just want you to check it. It's got some static feedback coming on.
I don't. I'm just talking into the laptop.
Okay, we got some static. I just wanted to make you aware. Sorry.
Okay, that's fine. It may just be the connection, or it may be the echo in the room gives it a little bit of interference. I'll try to talk a little quieter. That might do it too. So on the right, speaking of the colors, this is Jennifer Watts, and she is one of our living history docents. And I put this picture in here. I asked for permission to put the picture in because, I can explain to you the white and the gold, but almost every picture that you're going to see of suffragettes in their colors is black and white. There are a few colorized photos in the exhibit that you can see a few that have. You can actually see a dress that has the gold sash, but I thought it would be a good representation of what a suffragette would look like, or suffragist would look like, to see a photo of Jennifer in her living history costume. She does a great job with her interpretation too, if you guys ever want to come see a tour given by her as a suffragist. So there were also anti-suffragist groups or anti-suffrage groups everywhere. The clothing that women had worn to show themselves as, feminine and pure, and all of these colors that had been chosen to represent the suffragist movement, even though they did that deliberately, even though they deliberately tried to dress as feminine as possible, there were anti-suffrage groups who tried to make women and their dress, they criticized them and portrayed them as masculine and against those Victorian ideals of gentility and womanhood. You can see on the left, the poster is a propaganda poster, and I chose this one because it's just a particular favorite of mine, but I chose it also because there are so many of these, it was difficult to pick, and I thought this represented that mentality better than some of the other propaganda. But you can see the woman in the middle, who's a suffragist, is being escorted by a female police officer and a female fireman. And the implication there, and by calling it the never homes, is that women were never going to be in the home as they should, according to Victorian ideals. And then not only that, but they were going to replace the jobs of men, such as policemen and firemen, if they got the vote. And of course, that's not the case. They weren't trying to, take the jobs of these firemen and police officers. They really just wanted their right to vote. But that was some of the propaganda that was leveled at the suffragettes, is that it somehow made them masculine. So that it's not just in the clothing that people use these colors or utilize the colors to show the suffragette style. They also use them in their symbols, or the things that they march with. In this particular case, you see on the screen is a banner, and this is on display at the museum. And I chose this because I think it's beautiful, and it's actually been on display at the museum before the suffragists, or for the suffrage exhibit. But also, I chose it because I don't think people know what the bluebirds are for, because they just kind of look decorative. It is the gold of suffrage, so you have that color incorporated into it. And you can also see, we're gonna look at this dress a little bit more later, but you can see over here on the side, the dress with the gold sash. That's one of the gold is symbolic of American suffragettes. But this banner, to me, is a very interesting artifact because it's an example of how they use the colors in their style and their colors to show that they were suffragettes. But it also, the imagery of the bluebird is it's almost in honor of the first state referendum to give women the right to vote, which ultimately failed. But it was in Massachusetts, and the Votes for Women movement, they were able to force a state vote in 1915, and they used these little bluebird pins. If you see on your screen, the Votes for Women bluebird, that was a metal bluebird that the women walked around and nailed to trees, almost like campaign posters. And it looked small in the picture, but they were about a foot long. And the bluebird came to represent this first push, this first actual legislative push to get the right to vote for women. And so you'll see throughout all the states, really, but in this Tennessee banner, you'll see that bluebird utilized almost in honor of those first women who tried to get the right to vote. And of course, it's not until 5 years later that we have the 19th Amendment actually passed. But it was a start, and it was something that really galvanized the movement. But the imagery of the bluebirds been lost to time a little bit.
Hey, Amanda, please check your settings. We're getting some feedback from people that they're having a difficult time hearing you. Can you check your sound settings? Okay. Sorry.
I have to have Rachel do that.
Okay, let's do that. Thank you. I like the mask.
We have to have them if we're close to each other. Give us 1 minute. We'll see if we can change anything. Everything seems okay on our end, but we're double checking.
Sounds like wind's hitting the microphone or something, maybe. That's kind of the sound we're getting. Maybe echo cancellation being on. Got such good information. We need to hear everything you're saying. Gotta love technology.
All right, we messed with everything. Does it sound any better now?
Keep talking.
Amanda, you want to talk for a second?
Yeah.
So does it sound, I'm trying to maintain, I talk really loud, which could be part of it.
I don't think it's it. You sound great. It's like got a crickly sound going on. Jump back in. Let's see where we go. Thank you.
Well, we're in a very quiet room.
That sounds better already.
We'll see. I lowered my voice. Okay, so I was talking about the bluebirds and the Massachusetts women. That really, it galvanized the movement to become organized. Not that it wasn't organized before, but throughout the country, you start to see people, when these women first make the legislative push to have the vote, you start to see people feel more emboldened to get out there and march. Actually, this is the moment in Massachusetts is the time when there were a few intrepid men who decided to join in the women's suffrage movement. So it really changed things that there was this push on the legislative level. So I wanted to also make sure and not leave out the women who did not wear the colors of the movements. And you know, there were a lot of different styles. You saw, we're going to look at a couple of dresses here at the end of the presentation that women would have worn at the time, but you've already seen the all white with the gold sash. There were other styles that connoted that you were a suffragette or a suffragist. And this one that you're seeing on the screen is what you would think, or what you would see when women began working. So in the late 1800s, you really see a lot of women entering the workforce. Most of them worked in textile factories. Some of you may be familiar with some of that history. There's a long history of the textile industry, especially in America, putting women to work and not necessarily in the best conditions. I would actually recommend, and it's a little off the subject, that if you are interested in that, you should watch a documentary about the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. It's how the textile industry kind of changed the working conditions for women. But at the time when women were going to work in these textile factories, it was considered quite progressive. My own grandmother worked just down the street at Worthen Bag and Cotton, which was a textile manufacturing facility, and so did all 6 of her daughters. So, you know, for me, there's a personal link there, but it also, again, the conditions weren't great, but it was progressive that women were going to work. And those underskirts and those dresses that I showed you before, women cannot work in that, especially in a factory. So you would often see working women wear more streamlined silhouettes like the one in the picture. And then there was also this adaptation of kind of a military style as we get into the early 1900s. And some of that has to do with or is related to the military uniforms that you'd see from nurses. There's definitely some influence of World War I in those styles because women were working as nurses. But this more military uniform style became very popular in both England and America. And it also has to do with leisure activities. And I always get a little bit of a kick out of this, that women's skirt silhouettes changed by the late 1800s, early 1900s because of the popularity of bicycling. And bicycling probably sounds very quaint and old-fashioned to us, but at the time it was all the rage, and it was considered this leisure activity that kind of swept the nation as a fad, and women wanted to do it too. So you see their skirts start to rise, and by rise I mean right at the ankle, nothing higher than that. But so there also is this kind of progressive idea that women can take part in leisure activities. And then all of those things kind of added together, you know, women are feeling more emboldened, they're feeling more liberated in their clothing. And then as the 19th Amendment passes, people started to definitely feel empowered, kind of reject the clothing restrictions that were put on them. And as fashion historians and fashion people, I know that you guys are familiar with some of the terminology, like flapper dresses, and I don't have to explain that as much as I would to other audiences. But what I wanted to stress to end this presentation was how quickly we went from some of the dress styles I just showed you from the 1890s, and then, you know, the white dress of the suffragette in the 1920s, or the 19-teens, 1920s, to this look that you see on the screen. The ladies on my left in their flapper dresses, and how much shorter those hemlines get. You know, women have bare arms. And, you know, it was really, the right to vote, the suffragette movement in general, was something that really empowered women to feel like they could change their style and they could change their dress. So it wasn't anymore just about the vote or about working. Now it was actually a way to express yourself through your fashion. And I personally think this is where, you know, you could draw a line between what was dress and what was fashion, is when people have the power to express themselves the way they want. And there aren't as many of those restrictions put on what women are wearing. On the right there, the lady that you see on the right, her name is Catherine Talty Kenny. And she is wearing what a lady of means would wear, in her flapper dress there with her feathers and her headdress. She's an interesting character. She was born in Chattanooga in 1874. The portrait of her is on display in the museum and will be part of the Ratified exhibit, but it's been on display before. She moved to Nashville from Atlanta, and her husband was the president of the Nashville Coca-Cola bottling company, and she became very active in the suffragist movement. And she founded in 1915 the Tennessee Equal Suffrage Association, along with some of the other very important suffragists that you'll see in the exhibit, like Anne Dallas Dudley and some of the real leaders of the movement. But I like this picture of her because it shows that, you know, even women, which means even women who were a little bit older than the ladies here on the other side, they also felt really empowered to wear these new styles. So the legacy. I know this is something at the beginning before we came onto the screen that we talked about what the legacy of the suffrage movement is and what the style of social movements, how that carries over. And I'll answer that question at the end. But I wanted to show some of the more modern examples of how people have differentiated themselves by dress within a movement. And some of these, after that presentation, should look familiar to you. The Yellow Vest movement in France, which is very recent. The Yellow Vest movement was organized by truck drivers who were protesting high fuel prices. And one of the things that they carried in their trucks with them often is a signifier in France of truck drivers is a yellow vest. And it would be what they wore if they have to get out in traffic or have to, you know, stop their trucks so everyone can see them. And in support of these truckers, this movement erupted where people started wearing yellow vests to support them. And you can see in this picture, they also have something else on. They have on their red Varangian cap. So they are in this movement that happens in 2018, so 229 years before the French Revolution, or after the French Revolution. You have that symbol of the French Revolution showing up in 2018 in a new type of movement. So I think that's a really interesting way of showing solidarity between protest movements. And then in the United States, you can see there in the picture, female politicians adopted the white suit. And that, of course, harkens back to women in the suffrage movement, the all white. These are members of Congress honoring the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment just recently. And I think we all are familiar with that all white, the white pantsuit is supposed to be in kind of allegiance with the suffragists of the past. So this is, we wanted to do a virtual tour of the museum or of the new exhibit, but that is something that would probably have not worked out very well. It's difficult to film up in the galleries, and especially since we have reopened to the public as of July 1st. So we're going to give you a little virtual sneak peek of some of the items that are on display, some of the costume items. And then I would definitely encourage you to come to the exhibit and see some of these for yourself, because, you know, these are great pictures, but they don't really do the beauty of the objects justice. The first one here, which I don't know if you can see when I point with my arrow. Can you see that? Okay. This is a walking suit from the very late Victorian period. And it's a beautiful garment. It's polka dotted, which is unusual. It is made by Nellie Dennis, who is a well-known fashion designer in Nashville. She was the go-to person for women of society when it comes to dresses, and we have several of her pieces, and they are absolutely stunning. She had a shop downtown, just right on Fifth Avenue in the Mannix building for over 40 years. Her shop actually caught on fire, and then it moved to another location. But this is one of her pieces, one of her later pieces. And you know how it relates to the fashion and the style that we just talked about. You can see that this hemline is right above the foot, which is how you know that this is from the later Victorian period, the early 1900s. This is something that would have been comfortable for women of the time to wear. It's why it's a walking suit, because it's something that you would wear during the day to walk about town. This is also a Victorian walking suit, but it is a little bit on the fancier side. It's silk and velvet with a bustle in the back. And the bustle was invented in the 1870s. And so this dates that dress to about the late 1870s, early 1880s. Fortunately, we had a conservator come in and mount these dresses. Melanie Sanford, who did a tremendous job restoring them and mounting them, because I would have no idea how that bustle worked. But she bustled it up, and it's really interesting to see from the side. And it's interesting to see between these two, just a couple years in between them, you know, how women's styles and silhouettes changed. This one here, this wedding dress is belonged to Ida Bonner, who was the mother of Anne Dallas Dudley, who's Tennessee's most well-known suffragist. She figures heavily into the exhibit. And this dress isn't necessarily representative of anything with the suffrage movement other than she was the mother of Anne Dallas Dudley. In 1876, when she wore this dress, was the time where you start to see the early temperance movement and, you know, things that influenced suffragists or the suffrage movement happen. But really, we have it on display for its incredible beauty. It is a stunning piece. You can't see it in the photo. It has elaborate rhinestone work, all handmade by Doris Scales, who's also a Nashville fashion designer. And then the last one here, we've seen a variation of it before. This is a lace day dress from the 1920s. And this is really typical of what you see in those photos of the marching suffragettes. That's something people would have worn on a day like today's weather, with their gold sash, with their hat, with their votes for women. And they've been marching down the streets like they did in Nashville, like they did in Knoxville, and like they did all over Tennessee. All right, well, I think that probably wraps up my portion of it. I know that we wanted to do some questions, and I wanted to leave enough time for that. And so I know, Connie, you're gonna do the questions.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in. One thing we're going to try before we do that, now this is getting complicated, I think. Says, please change your audio settings to phone audio, Amanda, and call the number with your cell phone, and you should have a clearer connection. I think that's something Rachel can set up on the microphone on her laptop. Does that make sense?
Well, yes.
Or put it on the speaker phone and set it in front of you?
We're trying.
Okay.
You want me to go get my phone?
Because this is too good to miss, and we're getting people saying that they're hearing every other word. It's insightful. We all know that clothing tells people who we are and what we're about, and it's so interesting to see the history of that. And I know that these photos don't do this exhibit justice, and we all need to come see them in person. Now I have no sound. Let's just jump into some of the questions while we're waiting. Let's see here. Who were some of the important people from Tennessee that were involved in this movement? Okay.
Hey all, it's Marcia real quick. We actually had a fun fact come in so we don't sit in this awkward silence, so I thought I'd share that with you guys. But we had someone submit, have you looked into the Kansas suffrage yellow for the Kansas yellow sunflower? It dates back to about 1867 after the impartial suffrage amendment vote failed in Kansas. National U.S. suffrage activists said they wanted to adopt yellow because of Kansas and for those women who were in Kansas trying to pass that amendment. Susan B. Anthony continued to wear a yellow flower or yellow ribbon throughout her life. It looks like it came from Bobby Athen. So thank you for sharing that with us while we maneuver through this technical issue.
So we are in on phone as an attendee, so it's muted. We could try that, or if you want Amanda to try and just back up a little bit. It's up to you.
Hear you really clearly right now, Rachel.
You can hear me clearly?
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Maybe.
Let's just keep trying it on the computer.
Okay.
All right, let's try this.
Okay.
So one of the questions that we were asked were, thank you for sharing that, Marcia. Who were some of the critical players in terms of the women's suffrage movement in the United States, but more specifically in Tennessee? Like, who were some of the key players?
Well, I will say, so I'm not a suffrage historian. The curator for this particular exhibit is Miranda Fraley Rhodes, and she did years and years of research on this. But I do know from studying to present this that in Tennessee, like I said, our most famous is Ann Dallas Dudley. And the reason that there's a street named after her that used to be Capitol Boulevard. And the reason that she's so well known, and also Catherine Talty Kinney, who I showed you a picture of, the reason that Ann Dallas Dudley is so well known is she was a woman of great means. She was also a woman of completely irreproachable moral standing. And so when she joined the suffrage movement, it was almost a way of saying to, like, you know, the anti-suffrage movement, the people who didn't want, you know, who believed that women would, you know, they would vote down everything that men wanted, like saloons and whatnot. When she got involved, it was very difficult for anti-suffragists to criticize the movement as being unfeminine. So she's really important in the history of the Tennessee suffrage movement. And then of course, nationally, you already said a couple of the people. There's Susan B. Anthony. You know, the roots of the suffrage movement come out of the temperance movement. And so you have all kinds of women who were involved in the anti-alcohol movement, which is what temperance means. Some of them are people whose names I can't remember right now. But really, you know, it's more than just one or two people. It's really people who are on the ground marching, and then these women who became the de facto leaders.
Here's a biggie. How does dress continue on as a form of political activism today?
Well, I mentioned at the beginning the concept of branding and how that's something we're really used to, and we're also used to being able to wear whatever we want. I think one of the ways it carries on today is we're free to show that we support something. You know, if you can't see my shirt, but if I wanted to wear a Black Lives Matter shirt, I can, and I can show everybody that that means I support it. And again, that's a freedom that we might take for granted a little bit, because some of the things that I just talked about, you know, you had to be, it was subtle. Like, even though, you know, a bunch of women were walking in white with gold sashes and may not seem terribly subtle, they still deliberately tried to be as feminine as possible. They tried to present themselves in a way that society expected them to. And we don't have to do that anymore. If we want to, you know, express ourselves as being part of a music scene, a political movement, we can wear all of those things without repercussions. And I think that's how it lives on. And I think that's especially true when it comes to women, because we still occasionally, lots of times, get criticized for what we're wearing as being, you know, provocative, when it's not. It's just style.
Good point. Okay, someone asked, what would women that were not in the middle of the action, what could they have done to show their support from the movement from afar? And I'm going to add on to that, what can we do today when we're not the ones marching in the street to show our support for these things from a fashion standpoint?
Well, I think, so women who weren't involved on the ground, some of that, there were anti-suffrage women. So there were women who were not involved because they were against the vote. But there were other women who, whether because of means or family structure or even age, like I mentioned, my grandmother was 13. It would have been difficult for her to have gone out and, you know, been a suffragette. But I think what they did was really listen to what these women were saying as their cause. So they were hearing women who did have boots on the ground say, this is why I want the vote. And it's not because we want to get rid of all the saloons. It's not because, you know, we want to take all of the men's jobs. Listening to the people in the movement, I think, is really important. And I think that's an especially important lesson for today. I think if, you know, if we want to be effective, if we want to be good allies to any sort of political movement or social movement, then we have to listen to the people who've been doing that sort of thing for years. People who've been activists, people who've lived experiences, and then, you know, that'll make us, I think it'll eventually make us more educated about what the cause is, but then it'll also make us become a better friend to them. I hope that made sense.
It does. You guys all want to run down to the Tennessee State Museum today and check out all this in person. On that note, what is your favorite thing, must see at the exhibit? And tell us why.
Oh, at the exhibit. Well, I have a weird one.
Weird's good.
It's textile related. I like a lot. I mean, everything was chosen by our curator, and it's perfect in the exhibit. But I was asked to stuff this cotton drag sack, and what that is it's a 9-foot long canvas sack that women would have used when picking cotton. And my great grandmother in Clarksville, she did that. She was that's one of the ways they made do, was she picked cotton. And I had never really thought about how it was hauled or how it was carried. And this thing is enormous. I mean, it's twice as big as she was. And to think about it, you know, women throughout history, people throughout history, having to carry these things on their shoulder and then being able to handle it in the museum and try to bring it to life by making it look like it was three-dimensional. That was really special to me. I have a tendency to get a little emotional about museum objects, and that was one that I got a little teary-eyed about.
Well, we are very fortunate to have such a wonderful facility in Nashville, and thank you for being with us today. We apologize for the audio difficulties we had, but it was worth hanging on your every word, and we learned a lot. We hope y'all join us tomorrow for the On Point Manufacturing presentation of sustainability, manufacturing, and the future of fashion. We also have 4 designers that we're going to feature today through our Instagram and social media, as well as Shop Nashville events all over town. This is why NFW, and please use that hashtag as you repost and regram things all day. Everyone that signed in today is eligible for a 2 all-access tickets to the next live Nashville Fashion Week, valued at $800. We're going to have a drawing from everyone that registered, so congratulations for being here, and we appreciate that. We'd also like you to consider a donation to the Nashville Fashion Forward Fund of the Community Foundation of Middle Tennessee. That will assist us in continuing to be able to provide this sort of programming and our live events, hopefully next year. And we just got a lot going on this week, and ask you to follow and share and spread the news to all your friends. It's a wonderful thing that we have something to talk about and to just really show off Nashville fashion. Have a lovely day, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thanks, Amanda.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Bye, y'all.